and welcome to Question Christianity, where reasonable answers. Tonight we dive back in and take another look at the problem of evil. If you didn't check out the episode from 2 weeks ago where we started this discussion, I hope you go back and check it out. We had tons of great questions coming in. I hope that we can continue the same kind of dialogue tonight as we dive in and take a deeper look at the problem of evil. Is it a problem for Christianity? Is it the nail in the coffin of God? Well, we're going to take a look and find out. I'm Caleb Johnston. With me tonight, down here leading the charge with all this tonight, I'm going to shift him up and put him up here.
Oh, look at that. I've been promoted.
And who are you, sir?
Charles Graves, Reasonable Faith, as the title indicates, I guess.
All right. Beside Charles.
Hi, I'm Pete Good. I'm just loosely affiliated with these guys. Just try to stir up trouble.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We need some of that. And last but not least.
I'm Kevin Smith. I'm here to keep the others out of trouble.
That is surely true.
We definitely need that. So, Charles, you want to take us through a brief recap for anybody that wasn't here last time? They can go back and watch the episode for all the content, but do you want to go through a brief review of what we've covered up to this point?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's really important that, as you said, that this is to be understood as part two. So there's, I think, a very important first part. You could watch this part and get something out of it, but I think you're going to get a lot more if you understand the in-depth stuff that came before it. So we'd probably recommend watching that if you haven't watched it before this one. So where are we? Can you see my screen? Is that up available for everyone to see? Yeah, perfect. So what we have here is the general roadmap of the problem of evil argument. What we did is we initially talked about the problem of evil being divided into two categories. There's the emotional side, where people just feel emotionally unsatisfied with how suffering could happen or how God could allow that to happen. And that can be a very different thing than the intellectual side, where we have like the philosophical arguments of trying to reconcile how there could be evil in the world and how God could simultaneously exist with such evil. So, and then on the intellectual side, we didn't go into the emotional side. We'll do that last. But on the intellectual side, we further subdivided the intellectual into the logical problem of evil and the probabilistic problem of evil. Now, we haven't talked about the probabilistic side yet, but we did talk about the logical side. And what we basically discovered on the logical side is that the logical problem of evil, and that is the hard logical statement that evil and God can't simultaneously exist, is basically a bankrupt argument. And even atheists have admitted as such. I'm not saying every atheist that you'll run into is going to admit that, but on the higher academic side, the philosophical side, where the experts in the field, so to speak, have looked into this, they have recognized that there is no logical contradiction with God and evil simultaneously existing in the world. Any comments or questions so far? Maybe I've missed something and that you think should be pointed out, what we covered last time?
Yeah, so when you say no logical problem, you mean in the strict sense of deductive logic.
Correct,
right?
Correct.
Rather than inductive probability, which you'll get to.
Right. Right. So what happened was it's not like the atheist side of the argument said, oh, well, the logical problem of evil is bankrupt, therefore we're all going to become theists. They didn't do that. What they said is, okay, fine, you're correct that there is no technical logical inconsistency with saying that God and evil can simultaneously exist. What they did is they took one backward step and said, okay, although it's possible, it just doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem probable. We don't see, although it might be possible, it just doesn't seem likely that if there was a loving God that he would allow so much suffering to exist. yes, it's possible. It just doesn't seem likely given the amount of suffering that we see. And that's a different argument. So it's a more of a, again, as the slide shows, it's more on the probabilistic side. Probably doesn't exist than it is on the can't exist side. Does that help clarify? Okay. All right. Now, the bad news is that for the theist, the probabilistic problem of evil is a much harder thing to answer. It's a much harder argument to answer. And so we're going to go through this. We're probably going to spend most of the rest of our time on this argument on this subcategory right here, the probabilistic problem of evil. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have good answers. I think we have absolutely outstanding answers. Matter of fact, I think each one of these answers, each one of these represents an individual answer to the probabilistic problem of evil, and I think all of them are absolutely outstanding. Again, as I said in the first episode, and I think it bears repeating, I didn't invent any of these. I'm just kind of like a parrot, and I'm happy to say that there are much greater minds than me that have come up with these. What I did was kind of gather these together in a PowerPoint slide that I could present to you guys and some other people that I thought these were very robust answers to the problem, and I found them helpful, and so I wanted to pass them on. So here they are. Now, you'll notice that I have these, of course, in the typical Southern Bastic acrostic. I have the Veritas word right here to help people remember what these are. Now, I will say I use this. Is this acrostic acronym? Is it acrostic, right? That's the right word, right? Yeah, okay. I use this all the time, the Veritas. And whenever I hear someone bringing up the problem of evil, and that could be a skeptic, it could be a believer who's struggling with that, it could be just a discussion that I'm having. It's like if I've got a pencil or paper, I'll literally just start writing down Veritas. I'll write it down, and then I'll kind of go through and I'll outline those, or maybe I'll just go through them in my mind, because they're so helpful to just have a roadmap in your mind of how you're going to answer this, and maybe all the different ways. And you can pick and choose. You don't have to necessarily go in order. But each, like I said, each one of these is pretty robust in themselves. But at least then I've got something to go on. It's like, okay, Veritas, oh yeah, Vantage, End, Rebellion, Incomparable Time. So I go through those, and then, man, now I've got like this 7-part answer that I can answer this problem of evil. So Veritas, that means truth, does it not? All right, so that's a kind of way to remember this. All right, now, let's, if there's no questions or comments on that, we can dive into the individual points here.
We do have a disagreement on the logical problem of evil. The truist, who joined us a little bit last time, indicates that he disagreed with that. He says what happens is Christians started removing powers from their version of God in order to defeat the problem of evil.
Okay. Well, again, we handled that last time, so I would just, I don't want to dismiss this at all, but I'd say go back, watch the first one where we handled this more in depth. Mm-hmm. So again, we're just doing a recap. And again, I'd point them to even some of the other resources we pointed out. There's a good video on this. In the video that we watched last time, we didn't, I don't think we diminished any of the powers that God said. We gave him, that wasn't even part of our dismissal.
There's a fallacy where people believe when we say God is omnipotent, that he has the ability to do anything, and that's actually not a claim that Christians make. In fact, one of the catechisms actually says, what can God do? God can do all his holy will. In other words, he can only be true to himself. But that's, I don't want to get derailed and run off the deep end on that.
Yeah, so I just, good question. The truist, please go back and watch part 1, and then deal with it there, and then maybe come back and we could follow up on that. Yeah, and because I don't remember that being any part of our argument.
Right, and I was going to say, if there is a particular version of the logical problem of evil that you'd like to see us address, please feel free to email or throw that in the chat, and we'll try to address that at some point once we're wrapping up and taking questions on this series.
Yeah, we have no shortage of time. I mean, it's our podcast. We can stay on this as long as we want, or as long as, more importantly, that people have interest in it. So great. Like to see the input and the pressing of the issue.
Definitely. Thanks for the input, though.
All right, so we are on the probabilistic problem of evil. All right. So we're going to go forward. I just went back to the roadmap. All right, so here's our first one. We're on the probabilistic now, and Vantage. Vantage just being a short word for, well, not a short word, but a word to describe the fact that we don't have the vantage point to even make this argument that God could not have a good reason to allow all the suffering. So there are at least, well, let's talk about chaos theory. So chaos theory is this highly complex, or is the understanding that there are highly complex systems like the world that we live in that are just too difficult to predict. So the stock market being one of those, human behavior tends to fall in this. There was actually a really cool movie. I don't remember what year it was released, but it's called Sliding Doors. And if you haven't seen that movie, that is just a really great movie that deals with the complexities of life and how the smallest choice that a person can make in one area of their life can just have these drastic repercussions. And what's so cool about the movie Sliding Doors, and I won't ruin it, but at the very beginning of the movie, it shows a woman trying to make it onto a subway train right as the door's closing, and as she's going for the door, and just as the door's closing, the movie kind of obviously splits. And in one version, she manages to just barely squeak in and make it onto the subway train. And the other one, she kind of makes it, and she doesn't quite make it. The door closes and she gets shut out. And so and that's the thing about that movie is that seems so realistic. Like there are things that sometimes just barely happen, or something happens, just the light changes early, or you make the red light, you don't make the red light, then what happens? And something as simple as making or not making a subway train has these very realistic consequences in her life, and it follows those paths. But that's kind of this idea of chaos theory, which is the smallest things that happen in our life can have dramatic consequences, not just in our lives, but those lives that are around us. Matter of fact, in that movie, Sliding Doors, the reason that she makes or doesn't make the subway train is, in one version, she's slowed down on her way to the train by a little girl who's playing with a doll and happens to kind of just make her, stutter step a little bit. And in one version, the girl's playing with the doll one way, and another where she's playing with the doll a different way. It's like that smallest thing that she's playing with the doll, and that causes her to kind of slow down just enough to where she doesn't make the train. And because she doesn't make the train, then this and this happens in her life. And again, I don't want to ruin it, but it's a fascinating movie, and to see the end result of that. So the atheist, again, to back up, what we're trying to address here is the atheist argument is there's so much suffering in the world that God probably can't have a good enough reason. And the rebuttal to that is, how could we possibly be able to know that? We can't predict the smallest things in our future, let alone what's going to happen in my life in 10 years from now, and 20 years from now. The decisions I make now can and will have consequences 10 years, 100 years, and 1,000 years later. Big, small, dramatic, who knows? Don't they say that Hitler tried to get into art school and was denied? Like, what had happened? How close was that? What if he had made it? Imagine the consequences. So to say that something as insignificant as a person making a train or someone getting into art school, like the repercussions that could have, and the amount of suffering, to be explicit, that God might allow in one scenario could have dramatic outputs in the world. And so we are not in a in a position to rightly be able to say God probably doesn't have a reason for allowing that. We just don't know. We can't know. So perhaps the natural disaster in one generation leads to a dramatic increase in saved people in the next. We don't know. We're just not in a good enough position to make such a judgment. Comments? Questions? All right. All right, the next four are kind of in a grouping category. They're individual points, but these four are things that not only does Christianity answer, but that is part of the Christian worldview. Christianity explains and even predicts suffering because of these 4 points of our Christian theology. So there are 4 Christian doctrines that explain and even predict suffering. So far from having to retreat from the issue, I think we can boldly share our faith and be able to help explain why the world is as it is because of these things. So the first one is end. Now, this is just the best word. It doesn't mean what you think it is. So I mean end, the word end in this point, as in the purpose, like what is the end result? And in this specific case, the question is, what is the chief end of man? In other words, we're talking about the purpose of life. So the catechisms, for those that aren't familiar with catechisms were teaching tools, and still I think the Catholic Church, well, many Protestant denominations still use some of the catechisms, but they're teaching tools, and although it kind of sounds like a weird old word, they're really a great thing. Pete, I was glad to have Pete bring that up in his previous response. So catechisms it's just a collection of questions and answers, and they're used to teach. So people that are new to the faith or children that are learning their faith, we have these questions and answers, and they help teach. Now, the people that came up with this, although the Westminster Catechism, the one we're going to look at right now, came out in 1649. Like, that's a long time ago. These people were not dumb. Just because they occurred a couple hundred years before our current time, you know, I think we have this ageist view of people in the past as being kind of dumb or unintelligent. These guys were sharp, and the Westminster Catechism is one of the finest catechisms, I think, that the Christian faith has ever produced. Now, in point in fact, the first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism actually answers this very question. I mean, the problem of evil and suffering, as we saw in our first session, is not a new issue to be dealt with. And so the first question helps contextualize the evil and suffering in the world. So it was written in the Westminster Catechism, written in 1649. And the first question is an awesome way to start a catechism. It says, basically, what is your purpose? The first question is, what is the chief end of man? Basically, there's another way of saying, what is the chief end of man? Like, what's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life? And the meaning of life is, the answer to the question is, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. So what's the point about that? Why are we linking this to the problem of evil? And the point is this, that knowing what the meaning of life is, this is critical. Knowing what the meaning of life is also knowing what the meaning of life is not. And I think that there is a hidden assumption in when people talk about the problem of evil. There's an assumption of what they think the meaning of life should be. So the problem of suffering is a question with a mistaken assumption. The problem of suffering is a question with a mistaken assumption. Let me read here from the slide. Namely, that if God were good, then we'd experience nothing but happiness, pleasure, and comfort. Or that a lack of happiness, pleasure, and comfort mean that God is not good, right? So there's kind of this built-in thing where if God is good, remember we saw that in the first thing, if God is good, then He'd want to stop suffering. But we're assuming there that God's only purpose for us, that our meaning of life is to live in comfort and pleasure and happiness all the time. Like we should just be happy little pets that are living in a little hamster cage. Like God is bigger than that, and he made us to be bigger than that. And the meaning of life is not just comfort and pleasure and vapid happiness. It's much deeper and more meaningful than that. The meaning of life, your meaning of life and my meaning of life, is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And that might entail suffering. Happiness, pleasure, fun, comfort, these are all not the meaning of life. I'm not convinced at all that the happiness and pleasure and comfort are even good in and of themselves. There's plenty of happiness and pleasure that are not good things. The meaning of life is relationship with God, character, love for God, love for our neighbor. 2, in all things, try to bring as much glory to God, to our Lord, as possible. This is what is truly good. In fact, I think that if the meaning of life is what we're saying it to be, to glorify God and enjoy him forever, that it's quite likely that God would create a world that would constantly remind us of this. In other words, to constantly remind us that we are not here to just be in pleasure all the time, that we have a much deeper purpose. And sometimes those pinpricks, and sometimes they are robust periods of suffering, are here to remind us that this is not our world, that this is not the end game, that our purpose in life isn't to just be happy all the time. I think one of the most interesting definitions of evil that I ever heard is that evil is a violation of purpose. Evil is a violation of purpose. So, I have this slide up here of a hammer hitting a screw, and obviously you don't use a hammer to drive a screw, and it's a violation of purpose. Is that evil? I don't know that it's evil, but there's something to this, because you think about Lucifer, right? And what does Lucifer mean? Right? Lucifer means the one who brings light. That was his purpose. He was created to be the light bringer. Lucifer is the light bringer, the one who brings light. And what does he bring? Darkness, right? And if we were created to worship and glorify God, but instead worship an idol or ourselves, that's evil. That's evil. When we worship pleasure, despite being in glory to God, that is evil. And yes, if my wife goes into the garage and grabs my hammer to drive in a screw, maybe that might be evil too. I don't know. All right. I have these pictures up here. I don't know if you've seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge. Excellent movie. So on the right side is just a picture from the movie. On the left side is a picture of the actual individual from the guy from Hacksaw Ridge, whose name escapes me right now. But I want you to just focus in on that picture of the movie there on the right, right? And I want you to think, is that fun? Is that pleasure? And if it's not, is it then evil? So I think it's not evil. I mean, that the war behind it that's happening, but that action right there, to go in there and to experience what was suffering for the sake of another human being, to love his neighbor, and obviously in the movie, if you've seen the movie, to glorify God by his actions. That was his purpose. And I think that guy had a laser clear. This is a real person, right? It's a movie, but it's about a real human being. That guy really did that stuff. And I think he had a laser clear focus on what his purpose was, and it was to glorify God. And I think that we should not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So on the flip side of this, we put perhaps a whole new paradigm shift on things. Now, I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that having fun and experiencing joy is wrong or evil. That's not what I'm saying. Right? I think God put plenty of things in this world for our pleasure, but I don't think that's merely our purpose. That's my point. And I might go so far as to say that the pursuit of pleasure at the exclusion or at the expense of God, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake might be evil. So it's at least something to consider. That would be the chief end of man. So I guess the main point here is that the problem of evil, the way the world sees it, vanishes when we understand that the true meaning of and purpose of life is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Questions on that? Let's stay here for a second. Chief end of man, what our purpose is, means what our purpose isn't? Nothing. Okay. All right, we'll continue on then.
We're with you. You haven't lost us.
Okay. All right. So that was E, and we did vantage. Right. We're not in a position to really make that call. That in itself is a totally adequate argument. Chief end of man is to glorify God. It's not pleasure. Right. And I think that in itself is also a full answer to this problem. Okay. Next, rebellion. Mankind is fallen and is in a state of rebellion against God and His purpose. And you may think it's not. Hey, fine. That may be what you believe. But what we're talking about is, does Christianity have a solid answer for this? And part of the Christian doctrine is that man is fallen, that we are in a state of rebellion, and we are going against His purpose. So it fits perfectly into our worldview. A matter of fact, as I say here, it's not just a little bit of rebellion, it's basically high treason. We are fallen. We are the problem of evil. How much of the problem of evil is us? I understand that there are accidents and diseases and natural disasters and other non-man tragedies, and I will talk about these in a little bit, but just think for a second about how much of what we really think about the problem of evil is caused by human beings causing evil to other human beings. We are the primary evil. Romans 1 predicts this. Romans 1, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. And then in 3 times in that one chapter, just in that one half chapter, 3 times it says, and God gave them over, and God gave them over, and God gave them over. It's like mankind is so rebellious and so resistant to the calling of God that God just says, if this is what you really want, then I will let you have your free will, and you can cause all the suffering to one another that you are going to do. So we are the problem of evil. I find it ironic. Matter of fact, actually, it upsets me more than a little bit that this world has turned its back on God, done what it has been commanded it ought not to be done, and then all the evil that results for that, they turn around and then accuse God of, or accuse that of being proof against God's existence. This is quite remarkable. They rebel, they cause the evil, and they say, hey, there's so much evil in the world that there can't be a God. It's like, it's just you, man. It's just me. Me too. I do not for a second think that I have not caused grave suffering in this world. That is absolutely true. But just like them, so was I. So here's a little thought experiment. If you're a Christian, just think for a second. They say, the last time I heard of a serious statistic, that there are a lot of people that claim to be Christian. They're nominal Christian, XYZ, but the number of actual Bible-believing Christians is a very low statistic. Like maybe it's single digit, and maybe that's grown. And there's certainly been some remarkable growth in China. But let's just say it's somewhere in the single digits. That actual, true, evangelical, Bible-believing, Christ-trusting Christians is single digit in the percent. So here's a thought experiment. What if 50% of the world, 50%, just half, just half. I mean, that's a lot. But if 50% of the world were true Christ following Christians, how much evil would never happen? The evil that did happen would be ministered to. If 50% of Christians, how much less likely would genocide be? How much less likely would racism be? How much less likely would starvation be? How much less likely would war be if just 50% of people took the commandment to love their neighbor and to love God? Well, let me put that in the right order. To love God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love their neighbor as themselves. If 50% of the people took that seriously, how much of the person-caused suffering would diminish in this world? Even natural disasters, if they happen, disease, sickness, would be ministered to caringly, lovingly, like if we really took care of each other like if we were supposed to. 50%. What if it was 75%? What if it was 100%? God gave us this world to take care of, and he gave us each other to take care of each other. And I am my brother's keeper. We are our brother's keeper. The other side to this is that the suffering in this world is a serious warning that something is seriously wrong, because something is seriously wrong. So the suffering in this world is the natural consequence of a fallen world and our sinful nature. Okay, you'd say, okay, sure, but okay, so it's caused by people, but God could still take it away, right? Couldn't God, if I cause suffering, he could still take that suffering away? Yeah, he could. But I think that would actually be cruel. And you'd say, what? Taking away suffering? How could that possibly be cruel? If you took away the pain in this world? Because the pain in this world is a wake-up call that something is actually wrong. He's saying, wake up, something's wrong. So there's, I have it in my notes here. There is, I think it's, I can't see it. There's something called congenital indifference to pain or something like that. But basically, some people are born with the inability to feel pain. That's not good. Like the children that are born with that have very difficult lives because they can be hurt and not know it. Their parents have to just watch over them like a hawk. They might go outside. They might literally like break an arm and not even break a finger, not know. Skin their knee, be bleeding profusely somewhere, not know. Like pain. In the right context, pain is good in that it tells us that something is wrong. It's not fun, it's not pleasurable, but pain is valuable because pain tells us that there's something wrong. So if it is the case, which it is, that mankind is in a state of sin and rebellion against God, then we deserve hell, whether or not we cause suffering or not. Our sin, if I sin, then I deserve to go to hell. It's not the rejecting of Christ that sends me to hell, although that certainly adds to it. It's my sin. If I wrong someone, that's sin. If I rebel against God, that's sin. I deserve to go to hell. And I do, by the way. I deserve that, right? Now, if that's the case, even if God was to take the suffering that I caused and diminish it or take it away, like I still rebelled against God. I still deserve to go to hell. What if I never knew that? What if there was never any natural consequence of that? What if while we were in this state, God did remove all the pain and suffering in this world? We would go on and sin and rebel, and there would be never any indication that anything was ever wrong. Then when we died, it'd be like, hey, surprise, you're going to hell. I know that you had this like totally amazing life and the world was great and everyone was happy and everyone was always laughing all the time. But yeah, you have to go to hell now. It's like, that's cruel because there's no natural indication. There's no warning sign, right? Pain is good because it's valuable. It lets us know that something is seriously wrong. In a very real sense, the pain and suffering in this world is a show of compassion by God, who is willing to call us out of this world and to himself. And this would include things like natural disasters and deeds and accidents and the like. Okay, so that's rebellion. Any thoughts or comments yet?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree that a lot of the pain and suffering they've endured in life has been more beneficial to their personal and emotional growth than perhaps many good things that have happened in their life. Not saying every scenario, there's certainly situations that break that mold, but I know personally from my experience, I've gotten far more growth from a lot of the painful suffering experiences I've had than from the good experiences I've had.
Yeah, I think I think we've all heard so many times, and we can even point in our own lives where we point back to times of even severe suffering where we say, if you could change it, if you could take it back, would you? It's like, I don't think so. I learned a lot from that, and I'll tell you, as a Christian, one of the hardest times in my life is when I grew closer to God, because that's all I had. Like, that was really good. It wasn't fun, but being pushed to grow closer to God was, in the end of things, one of the best things that's ever happened to me. A lot of people come to Christ. I mean, we have to keep our Christian worldview intact. This world is not all there is, which is what we're going to come to in a second. But to just kind of steal from my own thunder, if hell is real and heaven's real, then allowing someone to experience even severe suffering in this world, so that the result is that they kind of wake up from their rebellion and come to Christ and then spend eternity in heaven, it's like small price to pay. Small. That is a compassionate God who would use that suffering to basically slap us across the face and say, look, your situation is dire. It is serious. You need to wake up from this. This world is not all there is. There is something else coming, and you need to be made aware of it. So, yeah, I am very moved by that, and yeah, it's very convincing to me, at least. Should we move on? Any final thoughts? All right. Next point. Again, this is the third point in the Christian doctrine. Incomparable. The knowledge of God is an incomparable good. So, pain drives us to deeper meaning. Deprived of happiness, comfort, and or pleasure, we are forced to face the fact that this world will not deliver on what only God was meant to fulfill. This world will not deliver on what God only was meant to fulfill. Scriptures say that you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless. Sorry, that wasn't Scripture. That was St. Augustine. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Further, the knowledge of God, and this is the point, the knowledge of God in itself is an incommensurate good, or an incomparable good. So as William Lane Craig has said, the person who knows God, no matter what he suffers, no matter how awful his pain, can still say, God has been good to me, simply by the virtue of the fact that he knows God. Like, basically, all the possible pain and suffering that you could possibly experience in this world is incomparable to the knowledge of God himself while you're in this world, not even mentioning the world to come. It's like, I know God, and yes, this is horrible, but to know God is an incomparable good. That in itself. That's a very profound statement, I think. So just let that, I would say, just let that sink in, and think that, well, what did God tell Abraham? That he said, I am your very great reward. Like, I am, not you're going to heaven and you're going to play golf up there. I got this great hotel and this beach. You're really going to love it. No, I am your very great reward. Heaven is not heaven without God. Heaven is not heaven without Christ. It's hell. Like, the best golf course and beach you can possibly imagine, I guarantee you, in the infinite of time, would, if there wasn't pain and suffering to accompany it, would itself become a hell. There is only heaven with God. He is our very great reward. He in himself is an incomparable good. He himself, sorry, going scrolling, back, good. He himself is our greatest prize, our goal, our reward, our pleasure, and our rest. So it's kind of a short point, but doesn't mean it's any less profound. Perhaps it's even the most profound point of them all. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's part of that same catechism. Chief end of man is to glorify God and, or some would say, by enjoying him forever. Okay, so that kind of leads to our next point. Any comments on that one? Short but sweet, man.
I think that's really crucial and under-mentioned in these discussions. And I mean, partly because it's something that a non-Christian can't, experientially grasp, by definition. So we think, well, we might as well leave that out. But if we're talking about the logical coherence and rationality of a Christian worldview, we can't leave that anchor out. That's not just an accessory you mentioned. It's really at the core of who God is, who man is, our relationship with him, and what good and good life means. So, very, very important to emphasize that.
There's a great, this is maybe some, well, I don't want to call it homework, but William Lane Craig in his Defenders class has read, I think it's just called The Story of Mabel. So if you look up Reasonable Faith or William Lane Craig and The Story of Mabel, that story, that will rock your socks. Talking about the incomparable knowledge of God. I would have put it in here. Gosh, maybe I did somewhere. So if I come to it, then, but it's a little bit long to read the whole thing, but it is worth it. It is worth it to read that story, and you get this clear picture of how someone who ordinarily would just be going extreme suffering, and yet is delighted merely by the fact that she has knowledge of God. Story of Mabel. Okay, move on to time. You guys, we've got time to move on to time. One more. Okay, the knowledge of God spills over into eternal life, which is a mighty long time. In 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18, Paul writes this. He says, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction," they don't seem slight or momentary, but that's what he says. For this slight momentary affliction, by which he means this entire life, right? So this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Romans 8 says this, "For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as son, by whom we cry, Abba, Father." The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. And then it goes on to say this. Oh gosh, I hate it when I do that. Sorry, I was right then, thick of things. All right. Then he says this, verse 18. This is chapter 8, verse 18. "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed for us." Again, he's talking about the entire life. For I consider that the sufferings of this entire life are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed for us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. 1 Peter chapter 1, 5 through 6 says, "In this you rejoice." What's that? "Though now for a little while, for a little while, your entire life. If necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. And again, as he says, for a little while, that's it. In the ESV note, it says for a little while means the entirety of their earthly life. One of the most essential and critical things that we can do as followers of Christ is to remember that we are in this world, but we are not of this world. This is not our home. This world is not our hope. Our hope is far greater, far longer, and far better. We will be with Christ in glory for decades, centuries, millennia, eons. Entire universes may come and go, and all in an incomparable blink of an eye. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. So I would say, do we have suffering in this world? Yes. We were told we would have suffering in this world. It's worth it. It's worth it. Every second, it's worth it. And let me add this. Perhaps you're thinking, especially that during the last point of the rebellion and the warnings, that, hey, I'm already a Christian, so I don't need the warnings. Like, I already know that there's a heaven. I don't need to be to know this. It's like, yeah, you do. Yeah, I do. Although I'm already a Christian, I need to be constantly reminded, because it's just too easy to forget, to find stock in this world, to forget where my real home is, to forget where my real hope is, because you, like me, are still in the flesh, and this world is far too tempting sometimes. And so our Savior allows us to suffer to keep us focused on him and our ultimate hope. Incomparable. Oh, no, sorry. Well, incomparable, but we're on time. Okay. Thoughts on time? It's a mighty long time. Forever.
We're on.
Yeah, and I see you're heading into the overall evidence next. So just throw this out there for non-Christians listening, and they're like, well, okay, I see what you're saying about, if God exists, he's good, and eternity is, obviously greater than temporal things, and but why should I believe that? But in our overall topic, keep in mind the problem of evil as a counter argument against the existence of God is precisely and nothing more than an accusation that the attributes of God don't add up logically with the conditions of life as we observe it. So the reason I'm restating that and spelling it back out is answering the problem of evil only, by its very nature, only requires showing that if the classical theistic definition of God is true and this God exists, that it's not more probable that suffering defeats this belief. So in other words,
is good.
All we have to show is consistency, because that's all the accusation is. Again,
Right.
Put it another way.
Right.
When someone says God probably doesn't exist because of all the suffering, all the answer that's required for that is to show that it's still consistent to believe in God, logically consistent.
Yeah.
So now we can go on to consider other evidence, positive evidence, but the problem of evil itself is a negative attack against belief in God.
Right.
So It doesn't require positive.
Your God can't be good because he's allowing all the bad stuff to happen.
Right. And
Yeah,
all
he's a
it
bad
shows that doesn't follow, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't follow by strict deduction, nor does it follow by induction and probabilistically for the reasons you've given and others. Now, for a positive case for God's existence, that's another thing.
Yeah. What? Yeah. We're getting there.
That's what I thought.
I mean, I don't want to cut you off, but we are going there. Okay, good. Anyone else? No, okay, so let's move on. So all evidence. So again, veritas, so vantage, end, chief end of man, rebellion, incomparable, time. And now we're at this second to last point, all evidence. Remember, as Kevin just pointed out, the accusation is, with all this suffering in the world, God probably can't exist. And what that says is, this is all the evidence that I need, right? All I have to do is look at the suffering, and then based on that alone, I can say, it doesn't matter what else there might be out there, I can say God probably doesn't exist. And it's just this blinder to all the other things out there that might indicate God's existence. All right, so here's the interactive part of our thing. Okay, so remember, the argument is that due to all the evil and suffering, God's existence seems improbable. Not, it seems improbable or not probable. So we're talking about probabilities here, right? This is a probable argument, so we're talking about probabilities. So let's just do, this is going to be a quiz for you guys, a mathematical probabilities quiz. You ready? So I have here pictured a 6-sided dice. And so I'm going to poll each one of you. What is if I roll this dice, what is the probability that I will roll a 6 in one roll? Who wants to go first?
1 in 6.
Okay. Kevin?
That's what I think, but I might be wrong.
Okay. Pete?
So let me clarify the question. In any one roll or in the first roll?
In any, well, do you have two separate answers?
It would be 16% on a 16.666%.
Okay. 1 in 6? Are you going with 1 in 6?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. So, all right. So we're keeping track. I should be writing this down. So you all basically said 1 in 6. I'm keeping track of this for the record. All right. What is the chance if I roll for rolling a 6 in either the first or second roll?
I think it's the same.
Really? Okay. Kevin says still 1 in 6. So I have 2 rolls, and just one of them has to be a 6. So I either get a 6 on the first one and or the second one.
It's 16%, or it's 1 in 6. But I think it goes to if you're saying 2 out of all in the first 2, I think it may be 1/3 or 33% chance,
okay.
or 1 in 3.
Caleb?
And I'm not a mathematician; those days are long past.
Okay, Caleb, what's your answer?
Caleb, my math credibility is already gone. So
yeah, I went back and forth between 2 of these, but you just have 2 chances, but your odds are still going to be the same.
You get 2 chances, so
you get 2 chances, so you
probability.
Double it, so it'd be 2 in 6.
Okay, all right. So 1/3. Okay,
right.
So based on that, remember. So we're talking about probabilities here. So based on the information I gave you, that would well, I think Caleb's correct. Based on the information I gave you. What if I gave you some more information now, Caleb or Pete, and I said the dice is weighted?
I guess it then depends on how
it's weighted.
What if I told you that although you can only see 3 sides, the other 3 sides you can't see are also 6s?
That would make it 4 in 6.
Well, it certainly changes the results of the probability, doesn't it? You see what I'm saying? It's like, okay, if you take 1 point, you can make a right, correct probability justification. But if you really want the real probability, the more information you have, the better your probability is. In other words, if I told you that the other 3 sides were 6s, and I told you that the dice was weighted towards one of those 6s, it would be wrong to say that the chances were still just 1 in 6. That would be wrong, right? I mean, it's logically wrong. It's not just kind of wrong. It's wrong. Like, now that we have more information,
Unless you're robbing a casino.
The information that we had when we had a limited information was correct for the limited information. But if we really want the best probability, we are required to add all the information we have into that probability calculus. We don't get the luxury of just ignoring the fact that the other 3 sides are 6s. We don't get to do that. If we know it, we have to use it. If we know it, we have to use it, or we're not being logical. Okay? So what does that mean for us? Why am I talking about dice? And the answer is that the problem of evil is not the only thing about the existence of God, right? We don't get to just look at the problem of evil and then blankly close our mind to the other evidence for God's existence. We don't have that luxury. Atheists do not have that luxury if they want to stay logical. They can take the problem of evil and add it, but they don't get to look at it in exclusion and then make a ruling. Do we have other evidence for the problem, for the existence of God? Why, yes, we do. We have the Kalam cosmological argument. That's a pretty good one. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. There are actually at least 2 very formal cosmological arguments. There's the argument from contingency and the Kalam cosmological, which is the argument from beginning. We don't need to go into those in depth. I think each one of those is convincing in itself. We must take that into account. Do you know it? Do you know the Kalam? If you don't know it, you should go look at it. But you don't get, now that you know that it's out there, you don't get to make a probability ruling without looking at it. It's out there. It's strong. If an atheist believes in the Big Bang, there are certainly 2 things he's going to need to explain. We have the moral argument. The moral argument is a powerful argument for God's existence. Can you be good with God? Ask anyone tough moral questions. Racism, abuse, moral crimes, on what basis are they making these judgments, right? There is a moral argument for God's existence. Do we have to talk about it now? We don't have to go in depth. It's here on the screen, but it is a powerful argument. And now that you know that it exists, you must take it into account. You don't get to ignore it. It exists. You have to deal with it. We have the fine-tuning argument for intelligent design, teleology. The gravitational constants are just extremely high. Atomic weak force, expansion rates, initial entropy. We have people like Oxford physicist Roger Penrose, who co-authored a book with Stephen Hawking. This is not just some Christian guy you get to throw away. He says, I can't even recall seeing anything in physics whose accuracy is known to approach or even remotely approach a figure which describes the fine-tuning of the argument. Sir Fred Hoyle, who's the guy that actually coined the phrase the Big Bang, says a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces at work worth speaking about in nature. Okay. Again, we don't have time to go into the complete teleological argument, but it exists. It's a powerful argument for God's existence. You must take that into account, or you're not being logical. The resurrection, powerful argument for God's existence. Something happened. We spent a whole series going over this. The life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is an extremely compelling argument for the existence of God. If you don't know the details of that, that's a, oh gosh. How big is Habermas's book so far? It's not even published yet. His new book. Someone is like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah, I
of
think
pages.
it's like 13 or 1400 pages is the last I heard.
It's, man, the argument for the resurrection of Christ is robust. If you just think that we're talking about some mythological thing that we're just quoting from Scripture, you are sadly mistaken. This is an in-depth historical argument for a miraculous event. If you don't know it, you can't. You don't get to use it. You don't get to say that God doesn't exist without taking it into account. Now that you know that it exists, you must logically use it.
And if Habermas is listening and he's got a 1,300-page book, I'm going to recommend he pull a J.R.R. Tolkien and split that into a trilogy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know that they're going to be making a movie out of it, though. All right. So what's the point? Well, relative to the full scope of the evidence, despite the fact that we tore down the probability argument with the vantage and rebellion, incomparable, time arguments, all those, I think, dismiss them in and of themselves. In addition to that, we have a plethora of arguments for God's existence. And I've just talked about 4. There's plenty more than 4. And these are only part of all the evidence that God exists. The predominant philosopher Alvin Plantinga has expounded 24 or so arguments for God's existence. They must be taken into account. So, what do you think? Does God exist? He probably exists, right? He
Probably so.
He probably does exist. All right.
I know we're actually over time, Caleb, but can I say one thing real quick? Also keep in mind that the problem of evil is not just a problem for Christianity or even theism in general. Every human being, who thinks philosophically about these sorts of problems or issues has to have some sort of frame of reference for distinguishing evil from not evil. All right. In other words, some standard of good itself. That just leads back into the moral argument, as we spoke of earlier. Again, so let's just say that Christianity weren't true. Now, you still have the problem of evil, unless you deny that there's such a thing as evil. But honest, if we're going to be honest here,
Yeah.
None of the critics of Christianity actually believe that, much less behave that way.
Right.
So now you've just moved the problem over into a worldview, some other worldview, which will be far less capable of supporting a coherent account of objectively distinguishing moral good from moral evil. So you've only worsened your position.
Yeah, I think we said in the first slide, Christianity does have the best answer to the problem of evil. It really does. All things considered, all probabilities, all evidence, it really does have the best and fullest answer to the problem of evil.
If this is the problem that most troubles your soul, then your only hope is in Christ.
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess one thing I might kind of add in there is, if there is no God, where does the and we're kind of saying this, where does the solid vantage point, where does the solid establishment of that which is true come from? And if it is moving with humanity and moving based on society and what society says is true, then in reality, us proclaiming Christianity is true is no better or worse than anything else if there is no God. If there is a God, then we must use that definition of, again, God being the central basis from which truth is defined. Then we can evaluate Christianity is true or not because of who God is. If Christianity aligns with who God is and what God has done, then it is either on its way to being true or it is true. Thoughts on that?
Agree. I'm glad you guys are. I like your closing points here. Caleb, you want to wrap us up?
Well, on that note, Charles, is there more of this to go next time?
Yeah. Yeah, there's more. I think we got at least
Okay.
another full session left next
Okay.
time.
Good deal. Well, we will return
Yeah, we
next
didn't-
time.
We didn't do the emotional part. We didn't even get to the S in Veritas. So I
Perfect.
think we got one more session.
Great. Well, we will dive back into this next time. I just want to throw this out there before we wrap up. The Truest, we appreciate you being here and throwing some interesting points back. Certainly appreciate that. Never hurts to have pushback on things. So glad to have you here with us and pushing back on this. And hopefully next time as we wrap up and kind of on this, we can do a Q&A on some of this, or we can even do that as another session if necessary, where we just do questions and dive into some of this stuff that's come up along the way. But that's it for tonight. Hope everybody enjoyed it. We're glad to have you here. If you like this kind of thing, if it's helpful, please like, share. Dislikes even help. So, if you hated
Sure.
it, go ahead, hit the dislike button. That still helps raise us in the algorithm. So
Truth. Give us truth.
we appreciate it.
Yeah.
So, and share this around. We certainly appreciate all that. And we will see you next time.
Yeah, next time.
Thanks, everybody.